if somebody said to me right now, like I could snap my fingers and magically put like your baby in your arms right now, I would say no, because my life is not set up in a way that I want that anymore. A baby would not fit into my life anymore. So where does that leave me? Like, I'm technically still childless, but I also don't want a baby.
Yeah.
Like, I would say mindset wise right now, I feel much more child free because I'm super happy with the life that I have, but it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think if I use it child free, a lot of people would say, no, you're childless. And I am, and I feel child free. And sometimes I feel childless. So I just feel like those two terms are really trying to put a lot of people in boxes that they're just not expansive enough. I think we need new language to have these conversations.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Child Free podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Child Free podcast. Now, we, of course, are all about helping you make this decision of whether you want to have kids or stay child free. But the fact is that sometimes when you decide to have kids, you're actually not able to have kids. And that's a next step on this journey to see whether kids are something that's possible for you. But I think it's something important for us to talk about on here now, today, because there is a lot of insights and wisdom that we can glean from people who've made the decision to have kids and who weren't able to. And today's guest is going to have this conversation with us, a very important conversation about what happens when your plans for the future are not realized. Katy Seppi's 4-year infertility journey ended with a hysterectomy in 2017. At the time, Katy didn't have a single person she could talk to who was also involuntarily childless. So she decided to use her background in community organizing to create gathering places for childless people to connect, access support, and talk about the common themes that weave through their experiences. Katy hosts the Childless Collective online community, which is a year-round hub of connection and support for childless women and non-binary people. She's also hosted the Childless Collective Summit for the past 4 years, bringing together 100 speakers and over 8,000 attendees together. Katy has a Master's of Social Work degree from UGA with an emphasis in community empowerment and program development. Her current home is Savannah, Georgia, where she spends her free time on her bike, exploring swamps, reading, hanging out with her favorite people, finding the best tiki drinks, and anything else that strikes her fancy. Thank you so much for being here, Katy Seppi. It's an honor to have you on here, and I'm really excited to have you share your story with our audience today. So why don't we just launch right in and have you share a little bit about who you are, and after we do that, then I will ask you about your Kids Are Child Free decision. But first, broadly, what do we need to know about you?
Okay, so thank you for having me on, first of all, because I am just super excited to talk with you about this. Yeah, I'm Katy Seppi. I host the Childless Collective, which is an organization that aims to provide support and community for those who are childless, not by choice. And I live in Savannah, Georgia. And in my free time, I like to be out in nature. There's lots of amazing swamps here. So my favorite thing is to get to see alligators. And I like tiki drinks. So I'm always looking for the best cocktail bars. And yeah, I don't know.
Those sound like amazing things. And I have to say, as someone living in Germany, an hour from the Alps, hearing about like, oh, I love going to the swamps and seeing alligators and tiki drinks. I'm like, your life seems so interesting and exotic. And I kind of feel like I need to pay you a visit in Savannah, which, funny enough,
come visit me.
That'd be fun. I have to say, so I'm from Canada, for those listening who don't know, and I was chatting with an American friend of mine who's going back to the States this summer, and she said, oh, we're doing like a little girls trip and we're going to Savannah. I'm like, I don't hear about people going to Savannah because I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, and live in Germany. But
yeah.
Is it hot there year round? You have nice weather? Is it?
Summer is too hot. So summer is like, you don't really want to go outside for a few months. It's hot and humid, like unbearably so. And then the rest of the year is fantastic. So, I came from Utah where we get snow all winter and then like super hot 100 degrees in the summer. And so this is a nice change for me. I can be out most of the year and be comfortable.
Very nice.
I picked out like literally the most random facts to give you for my bio. So
everybody's going to think about like Katy, the swamp, alligators. No, it's amazing. I tend to like say the same few things like, oh, I'm an expat and I like hiking, but I'm going to throw out some really random facts next time too. Inspired by you and our conversation today. Okay, so I'm curious to know, now you run an organization or a community, as you mentioned, for all kinds of folks, right? All genders, women, who's part of this community?
Yeah, so the Childless Collective is kind of the umbrella for all the work that I do. So I have a lot of different random things. So like I host summits that I've done virtually for 3 years. And then my first in-person one was just a few months ago. And those are inclusive of all genders. And I'll do different like webinar chats or some different events that are open to everyone. The actual private online community that I host is just open to women and non-binary people.
Okay.
So,
yeah. And as you mentioned, this is for the childless, not by choice community. Now, people listening might be thinking, okay, we're like, I don't want to say jumping the gun here, but they're still just deciding, do I want to have kids or not? And I think people are probably well aware that this may not be available to them should they even choose to do this. Of course, questions of not just fertility, but people's unique circumstances, the ways in which they may be able to either conceive a child, adopt a child, whatever those means look like, that may not be something possible for them. However, I wanted to have you on today for a few reasons. One of which is I find your story very interesting, which I want to, of course, share with the audience in a while, and specifically, what your relationship looks like with this decision and how that's evolved over time. I also think that there is a lot that the child-free community and people considering a child-free life can learn from people who wanted to have kids and for whatever reasons were unable to. I think there's stuff we can learn. I also think that there are some parallels there, all of us, of course, being people without kids. So I hope to touch on all of those things. That's a little sneak preview of what's in store today. But first of all, tell us now, had you always wanted to have a child? And to be clear, right now, you do not have kids, correct?
No, I don't have kids. Will not ever have kids. I always wanted kids. So I grew up Mormon. And so a big part of the faith that I grew up in and just the culture that I was around, I didn't even I don't even think it ever occurred to me of like, do I want kids? Like it wasn't even something I considered that I wouldn't. It was just like, of course I want kids. And to the point where I actually had planned to, like, I really wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. So I didn't go to college till quite a bit later in life because I'm like, I don't really need a backup plan. I just want to be a stay-at-home mom. Like that was
the plan.
That was my vision. Yep.
Okay. And so this is something you always wanted. Now, I understand you're married, correct? When did you meet your partner? And then how did that decision making go? Like as far as timing, you thought, okay, I'm going to have a kid or kids. Did you want a big family or did you have a vision of that?
I think I pictured like 4 kids, like the family I grew up in. Like it was very much like paralleling like what I saw around me and what I experienced growing up. So actually when I got married though, my husband was more ambivalent about having kids than I was and was probably most of the time leaning more towards a no. So that actually is where my story shifts a bit. So where I was like, okay, well, in my mind, it was like, if my husband's a no, then it's a no, because I'm not going to bring a child into a situation where like both of us aren't just super excited. And so for actually probably the first like 8 years of our marriage, I thought we probably wouldn't have kids because he was still like, I don't think so. Okay. So that's actually the time where I did start college and I started to think about, well, what else might I want to do if I don't become a parent? And then I don't know, kind of like randomly, there was a point where he seemed to get really excited and was like, I think I do want this. I can envision it. I'm like, let's go for it. So we had, conversations about it. It was very like thoughtful. And so we decided to start trying. So we tried for almost 4 years. And during that time, obviously was diagnosed with infertility, but I found out I had endometriosis, which had been really presenting with like very debilitating symptoms for decades. But I had been to, I'm not kidding you, literally dozens of doctors and just had every single one of them telling me that nothing was wrong. And so I got diagnosed through my infertility. And then that kind of shifted me on a different path of trying to figure out like how to get treatment for my pain and those symptoms. And so there was just a lot in that 4 years. We had an IVF cycle that I ended up not having any viable embryos. So we did try that route. And then it just kind of got to a point where it was like, I don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to do this anymore. So I just decided that I call it like, we're going to stop pursuing parenthood and I'm going to figure out what a life without kids looks like. And I guess I should have thought that I had time to really consider that because there were so many years of our marriage where I assumed we probably wouldn't have kids, but I think it was always kind of just like well, maybe, I don't know. Like I hadn't processed any of it yet, I guess.
You raise a really good point because I think sometimes, and by the way, I'm not super, probably this isn't a nice word to use, but like militant about terminology as far as if somebody who doesn't have kids, let's say yet, calls themselves child-free, I'm like, you go nuts. But I would also say that when you still are open to the possibility that that may happen, I do think you regard your future without kids in a different way, or perhaps not at all. You may not think about it as fully. So I can see for you how that shift of, before you thought maybe they weren't likely, but maybe, as opposed to like definitively this is not happening, how that obviously changed things. So when your husband was ambivalent and you decided that like maybe this is something we're not going to do and you decided to pursue college, for example, how was that different for you, like emotionally speaking and through processing that? Because you up to that point, you still planned for a future with kids. You thought, this is what I want to do. I'm going to be a mom. I'm going to be a stay-at-home mom. This is going to be such a big part of my life. How did that period, I think you said it was 8 years. How did that differ from once you decided to stop trying to conceive and have a child? Were the two similar, or was it much more difficult afterwards when you knew for sure this was not an option?
Gosh, that's a good question. And it's complicated. I would say during those 8 years, I did actually feel like there's probably a really good chance that I wouldn't have kids because I did have that very strong like stance of if my husband doesn't get to a place where he's like super excited and like really, really wants it, then we're not going to have them. And I didn't ever like pressure him or push him or try to change his mind or anything. So I think during that time, it was like I knew there was a really good possibility that we wouldn't have kids, but there was still, I guess, like, I don't know, let's just wait and see how things go kind of thing. So it wasn't like final. And I think part of what made it different too was like having put so much, like infertility takes so much from you that going through like the 4 years that we went through, of like trying so hard for something and then not having it work out. That was like a very different level of grief because it was so final of like this, I'm definitely not having kids. So there was that final, like, there's not an option anymore. This is a finality. Yeah. And then I think the other piece of it was having to reckon with like how much I had been through and like sacrificed over that 4 years to try to get to that end goal of like having a baby and like to become a parent, and having to reckon with like, well, all of that was for nothing. Like I'm in the same place as I would have been if I hadn't done any of this, just in a lot more grief and having gone through like way more. So I think that made it harder, like having just put so much into it.
Yeah, I can imagine it's this feeling of like you've basically been ravaged by this process, emotionally, physically. And it must, I mean, you articulate it so well, have been like, what's the sense in this? And having like, been so battered without the outcome that I thought I was at least going to get that. I'm interested to hear for you, because this is something, it's first of all, from what I understand, it's sort of contentious, if you will, this idea of like deciding to stop trying when there, and I don't know if there were, maybe you can speak to this, but when there may still be avenues available. Because what I see oftentimes is that like, and especially with, changes in health, reproductive health and technology, like it kind of seems like it can go on forever to a degree. And I feel like there is this understandable tenacity amongst the trying to conceive for community that like you don't give up until you get the baby and the child. And I've heard and read about this. What was it like for you deciding to say no, enough? And how did you discern that for you and your husband that it was enough?
Yeah, so I'll just say first that I think that kind of attitude within the infertility community of like the never give up messaging, and there's a lot of, well, if you really want to have a kid, you can. Those I think are so harmful.
Yeah.
And we need to stop saying that, because the thing is, the assumption I think is that if you keep trying enough things, eventually you will have a baby, and that's just not true. I have met a lot of people who have literally tried every option that would be available to them and not had a baby. But I think there's also this other piece of it, which is you're completely discounting what it would take to get there, and just expecting that anything that you have to sacrifice is worth it. And I just don't think that that's true. I mean, I guess for some people it is, because there are people who go to, very extraordinary lengths to have a kid. There's a lot of different buckets, but you've got like people with unexplained infertility. There's, things that maybe they figure out what's wrong and you can try IVF, you can try like different things. The further you get down the infertility path, the more extreme the options are. They're more expensive, they're harder on your body, they're more time consuming, they're more everything consuming. And so you're having to sacrifice so much along the way, and it keeps, what you're being asked to sacrifice keeps getting huger. Like the further you get into it, of like, well, that didn't work, now we need to try this next thing. The next thing is always going to be like way more extreme and take way more from you. So, it's easy to say, well, oh, if you can't get pregnant, then just do IVF. Well, if you don't have insurance coverage for that, which most people in the US don't, and a lot of places around the world don't, then like my IVF cycle was 20 grand, and I didn't even do the implantation. I just did an egg retrieval with like genetic testing. So yeah, I guess it's easy to say that if you're not the one gambling your 20 grand each time you try this with not great results. Like, I think for one cycle of IVF, the average success rate, I think, is like 40%. I should have checked my facts before, but it's somewhere near there. So I don't know, like, do you want to spend 20 grand of your money to try for 40%? I don't know. Like they tell you need 3 rounds really to get up into like those higher percentage ranges of it working. So I don't know. Do you want to spend 60 grand trying? Or, here we have a private adoption system that it's also very expensive, like 40 grand if you want to adopt a baby. And people are like, well, why don't you adopt through foster care? There's so many kids that need homes. And that's true. But also the foster care system, the ideal scenario is not to adopt out children. That's not the purpose of that system. Like if you're looking at the best outcome in terms of like what the foster care system is trying to create, it's keeping families intact or keeping children with another family member when possible. And then having kids placed outside of their home is like the next option. So it's not really a system that is designed for that. And it really shouldn't be. I think if you have the best interest of like the kids at heart. So it's just complicated. And then if you get into more, advanced things like surrogacy or using donor eggs or donor sperm, it just opens up a whole lot of different issues, ethical issues, like things you got to figure out, money, time, all this stuff. It just gets very complicated, and none of these are short processes, right? So like if you go through 4 years of infertility and then you're like, well, maybe I want to adopt. Okay, well now you're day one of like a new path that could be like years long and not have any guaranteed outcomes. It's just, I don't think people really think about what they're saying when they say like, just keep trying or like, don't give up.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think there's way too much flippancy around all of this as well amongst those who are on the fence. I'm definitely not in the business of trying to put undue pressure on people and to scare them and say, the window is closing. Like, we obviously, especially as fertile women, in the instance that applies, that we receive enough of that kind of pressure. But the idea that indefinitely there'll be a baby on a shelf you can go buy, that's kind of the attitude of well, just go get a kid somewhere. There's lots of kids in the world. Yeah, there are a lot of kids in the world, and there are a lot of children that need homes. But of course, as you shared so eloquently, it's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot more concern and consideration that people need to be making if they are going down those paths in terms of what that's going to mean for themselves, the child. The notion that you can be of any age, any kind of background, relationship status, and just get a child through, again, all these different means, it's just not true. It's not. And I'd love to have, and I'm reminding myself to chat with you after this episode, because I think there could be some interesting people in your own community and circle that could be interesting to speak to some of these things. But I think we need to debunk the notion that there's just infinite possibilities of having a child should you someday, 30 years in the future, decide to do that, because it's simply not true. Yeah. I mean, it's not even true right now, to your point. If you decide you want a child. Yeah,
it's not. And it's also, I think there does become a point, especially when you look at adoption, or mostly adoption, I'd say, where to me, some of the ethics that come into it, there were some really big decisions there that I didn't feel comfortable with. So did I feel if I went through the adoption process that I would feel I would know that I was adopting a baby in a way that felt really good and ethical to me? When I look at the for-profit system that we have here in the US and the way that it's built and whose needs are placed first, I didn't feel confident that I would be doing the best thing for a child to adopt through this system. I didn't feel comfortable with it. And I think, if you listen to a lot of adult adoptee voices, this is also what they're saying. There is a commodification of babies that happens when it's well, I want this thing that I can't have. So how do I get it another way? And to me, there were a lot of ethical concerns I had because of the way that our system is set up. And so for me, I'm here in the US, what would it look like if you took the billions of dollars that goes into the adoption industry for profit every year here and put those back into programs and services to try to help keep families together? We'd have a very different system. And so it's everything seems easy when you're on the outside and just well, you can get a baby this way. And it's wow.
Yeah. Okay. And so when you decided to stop trying for a baby, a child, how did that decision arrive? Did you have was there a moment where you thought, enough, I can't do this? Or was it something more gradual? And then what was the response, both maybe in communities you'd been part of, or perhaps amongst friends, family, peers, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So I think there are a couple of moments that really stand out to me as these are kind of some final, these are some final decision makers. So one was that, I had surgery for my endometriosis and fibroids, and uterine polyps. So I had all three of those things removed and was told this is going to be your best time to do IVF because your reproductive system is as clean as it's going to be. So do IVF right away. And the IVF doctor I saw said, oh yeah, don't worry about the drugs making your endometriosis worse or your fibroids come back. It's not a thing. So I did that cycle of IVF, and my symptoms were worse than they had ever been, even pre-surgery. And so I think part of it was I was in such debilitating pain on a daily basis that I couldn't wear jeans. I was wearing maternity leggings every day because it hurt so much to have something around my pelvic area. I couldn't wear a seatbelt in the car without having I started carrying a pillow with me to put in between the seatbelt. My symptoms were really bad, and it was every day. So part of it was, do I want to put my body through this again? And so I saw almost a year passed, and I had moved to Atlanta at this point and saw a different reproductive endocrinologist. And I remember walking in, I was just going in for a consultation to be like, hey, this first round didn't work. Should I try it again? What would you suggest, kind of thing? And I remember signing the paper, like the form, just saying that I was there, like writing my name on the check-in thing. And my hand was just shaking. And I sat down in the waiting room and I just had tears streaming down my face. Like my body did not feel right. And then I had that consultation with the reproductive endocrinologist, and he said two things. One was that stood out to me. One was that when I said, well, my last RE had said that the drugs wouldn't make my endometriosis worse, but my symptoms are worse than ever since then. And he was like, well, yeah, of course doing IVF is going to make it worse. This is what like kind of feeds all the things you're dealing with, like fibroids and uterine polyps and endometriosis.
I'm smiling because I know that, because I have endometriosis, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, I'm thinking it's an estrogen dominant disease, which I'm guessing you probably had quite a few hormones going in you. So continue.
Yes. Yeah. So he was like, yeah, so if you decide to do IVF again, you should probably just plan on having another surgery right after, just like book it right after. So, and then I consulted with my endometriosis surgeon, and he was like, yeah, actually, I think it's irresponsible that they even did IVF on you. So I got really different like stories from different doctors that I talked to. But anyway, so part of it was hearing that. The second part was that he had said, the first thing I want to do with you is just check all of your, like let's do some blood tests and check like your FSH and your, I can't remember, AMH. I'm kind of glad I forgot the
like I never want to think about it again.
Like fertility world stuff. Yeah. And so I remember talking to my therapist, and I was saying to her, like, I'm kind of hoping that I get this blood work back and it just shows that my levels are awful. Like they've just tanked, because they were already kind of bad before my surgery and stuff. So I was like, I hope that they show that they're really bad. And she was like, why? That's weird. She didn't say I was weird, but she was just like, why? And I was like, well, it would give me like, it would kind of help me make the decision to just be like, I don't want to do another IVF cycle, because it would drop the percentage of it working so much that the percentage of it working would be so low that it would be like an easy decision to be like, I just don't want to do it. And I remember her saying to me, like, you don't have to do it, right? You don't even have to do the blood work. Like you can just say you're not going to do it and just stop. And that seems so obvious now to me, but at the time, I had just given like 4 years to this, like trying everything I could to have a baby. And the idea of just stopping, especially because I did have insurance for IVF coverage, so I could have done 2 more cycles, fully paid 100%, which is like unheard of. And it felt like, I don't know, like such a shame's not the right word, but it felt just totally bonkers to like not use the opportunity that I had. And so I think her saying that, it did hit me in a way that I was like, oh, I haven't even really given myself that option or like thought about that as something that, if I'm looking at all the options I have, like I could try IVF again, I could look into adoption, I could, I'm making my list. I didn't even have like, I could just stop and not have a kid. Yeah, I haven't considered that. So I think those two things, like knowing how much my body had been through and not really wanting to put it through that again, and then just giving myself the option to stop. It helped me think about it in a different way. And then I started exploring that. So that was part of it. And I think, I don't know, I wasn't actually part of any infertility community. Okay. So I really went through infertility with just the support of like family and friends. That's who I turned to. I would go on forums to look up specific questions, like about different treatments or what is the success rate of this or whatever. So I did pop into forums a little bit, but I never posted to any of them, and I didn't spend much time on them, especially not for like the emotional stuff. Like I had my therapist, I had friends, family, and that was like the circle that I needed. And then I think once I decided, okay, I'm not only not going to do this again, but after talking to my endometriosis consultant that I was going to, I knew I needed another surgery, and our conversations were like, what's the best, like if my goal is long-term pain relief, like what's the best option? And so I knew I was going to do endometriosis excision. He's like one of the best doctors in the country for that. So I felt really good in his hands that he could get everything like out that he saw. But also I was really curious about having a hysterectomy because my fibroids had come back so aggressively. And like I know that having a hysterectomy isn't a cure for endometriosis, but like the pain was like so debilitating with everything I had going on that I kind of just wanted to not have to have periods anymore and not have to like deal with like uterine pain. So, I made the decision to have a hysterectomy. So my hysterectomy was like 8 months after my IVF cycle. So once I kind of switched modes from like, it did feel kind of abrupt. Like, do I do a second IVF cycle or do I have a hysterectomy? And I think it did take some of my friends and family members some like time to catch up because like they weren't in my body. They weren't coming to all the appointments with me. They weren't in like the day to day of it. And so I think it was kind of hard to shift from like, I'm being a cheerleader to help you get this thing that you really want and like supporting you in it to like, well, wait, we're doing what now? And I think that, I don't blame them, but I think it's kind of a hard switch to go from like, well, how do I support? Like, what does support look like now that this totally different thing's happening? So I think it was a bit of a shift up, and I did find myself needing a different kind of support that I didn't really know where to turn to because I didn't have anyone in my life who was childless not by choice. So that's actually when I started kind of reaching out to try to meet other people in the childless community. And I did that through starting a blog and an Instagram account. And my hope was just that I would find even just like a couple other people who were going through this too, because there weren't all of the support and easy ways to link in and the forums and all of that. So I was just like, I just need a couple people that get it. And so that's kind of how I started my work in this community. So,
and you found more than a couple, did you not?
I did.
You built quite a community. I was telling someone about our upcoming conversation. I said, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs, obviously, of the childless space, but I would guess you're probably one of the biggest globally, or certainly in the States, to support people in this way. Or, I mean, I know it's not a competition, but like, if anybody is going through this themselves, obviously, I very much recommend they check out your work.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think I probably am one of, like, if you look on Instagram or like the work that I'm doing, I am one of the people out there that maybe has like the largest communities, but I think it's also so small compared to like other communities, but it's just because not much exists. I was actually really shocked at how little exists. So there are people like, I think probably people's first introduction to people in the childless community is probably Jody Day. Like, she is someone who's been doing this work for like 10 years, and she actually started the online community that I now host. She had already created that community, and then a few years ago decided that she wanted to focus on other work within the childless community, specifically like aging without children. And so asked if I wanted to kind of become the new host and take over for her there. So, but she's been doing work with the childless community through Gateway Women. And then, there were a couple of books that I found that were kind of memoirs that people had written. And those people weren't really in the childless community anymore. Like, they're still childless, but they weren't like engaging or creating content around that. They were like just living their lives. So I couldn't really like connect with them. And that was really all I could find when I was first starting. I think there were maybe like 2 or 3 Instagram accounts that I knew of, and that was it. So I was just kind of shocked because I was like, am I the only person that went through infertility and didn't have a kid?
Yeah. And it's, I mean, you and I talked about this sort of offline, if you will, before our conversation, but like this and these things, being child free, which of course is becoming more prevalent in the media, and certainly being without kids due to circumstance, it's not a niche problem, right? Like, it's like we act as though, or we feel as if when we're going through this, even this question of, do I want to have kids or not? The number of people who've said to me, and I felt the same way, am I the only person asking this question, or does everyone just definitively know what they want? It's so easy to feel alone and alienated and shameful. And there are so many of us in our respective areas that are kind of, either suffering in silence or feeling very lonely or weird or what have you. But I mean, kudos to you for seeing that this is a problem, that it seemed as though you were the only one, and then discovering you're certainly not.
Yeah. And honestly, it wasn't even, I didn't even start this thinking I want to switch my career to doing this full time. It really was in the beginning just like, I just need to find a couple of people. Mm-hmm. I just need that. Like, I just need to be able to like say what's going on and have some kind of an echo back of like, oh yeah, I get it. I'm going through that too.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to find, so I know I've looked distracted. It's because I'm looking at the difference. I've screenshotted this, the difference in hashtags. So even between like the Childfree versus Childless community. So like on TikTok, the hashtag Childless has like 8,000 posts.
Which is nothing. Like, hello, it's TikTok. It's young women.
It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And then it's the same thing with Instagram. Like child is actually bigger there. There's like 66,000 posts, but I think that if you look up Childfree, I mean, the Childfree community in terms of like what you can find on social media is small in the big scheme of things, but is so huge compared to people talking about being childless not by choice that it is really, really hard to find each other.
All right, it's time for a quick break so I can read one of your podcast reviews. This one is from Laura Ryder in the USA. She says, the Kid Decision podcast I've been searching for, 5 out of 5 stars. I've been on the fence about having kids for a while, and finding this podcast has been so valuable. I love how it switches off between kids versus child-free perspective each episode, and Keltie is such a good and neutral interviewer. Haven't found anything else quite like it, so I'm so glad it exists. Has led me to many aha moments. I love these reviews. Folks, every time I get one of these, it just means so much. And I know that the more reviews we have, the more likelihood there are that other people are going to discover this podcast. So go ahead, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can leave us a star rating on Spotify. Sadly, you cannot leave a written review there, but every review, every rating helps so much. So take a quick moment, hit pause, or when you finish this episode, don't forget to leave a review. And maybe, you never know, I might just read your review next episode. I just want to briefly address the endometriosis, only because, I'm curious for you, and I realize like casting our eyes backwards and saying, if only, it's not super helpful, can generally advise against doing that. But having, I'm going to say less, my endometriosis, when it was finally discovered, was not as advanced as far as like staging and so forth, but likewise had been causing me basically from the word go, when I got a period, major issues that were always told to be normal. It was initially why I went on the birth control pill in my late teens, coming off it finally with the thought that perhaps I would get pregnant. That was one of the reasons that, I was like, do I ovulate? What are my cycles like? Started having massive issues. Finally had an excision surgery, I think 3 years ago now. And we know that it takes about 10 years for women with endometriosis and similar, illnesses, disorders, whatever the term is we want to use, none of which are pleasant, to get discovered. Had you ever thought, was there a resentment? Do you feel like the medical system has failed you, and the fact that it took so long to get discovered, and knowing that if it would have been sooner, maybe your story would look different?
Yeah. Sorry, this is like hard to talk about because I have so much anger about it. Because I do think that if I had access to a diagnosis and excision surgery, maybe as like a teen, when my symptoms first, I mean, I was the same as you. Like I had terrible periods when I started them in 5th grade. So this was like a lifelong thing. And I think it just got normalized to where it had to get really bad for me to even know that it was abnormal. Because it was like, oh yeah, this is just what a period is. And like I remember going to like the emergency room in 8th grade because I was having such bad ovulation pain. Looking back, I would assume that I probably had an endometrioma or like some kind of a cyst or something, but they didn't even do a scan or anything. They were just like, when was the date of your last period? Sounds like you're just ovulating, go home. And I was like doubled over, like couldn't stand up kind of pain. And so when you are going to doctors, even the gynecologist, because I did go every year once I got to be like, I don't know, 14 or 15, and they give you that form that's like check the symptoms that you're having. And it's like how bad are your periods on a scale of 1 to 10? And like they ask all those questions, and I was putting like worst ever on all of them. And no one ever like said anything to me about it. So in my mind, I just think all that got normalized. Like my mom was teaching me how to use 2 of the Super Plus tampons at a time so that I could attend class during my period in junior high. Like I had really terrible periods and terrible pain like forever. So yeah, I do think if I had gotten diagnosed and had excision surgery younger, would I still have had my fertility? Like maybe. I think there's probably a good chance that I may have retained that. But so there's a fertility piece, but there's also this piece of like just my quality of life. Yeah. And when I think about like, I don't think I really realized it at the time because I was used to living in such debilitating pain all the time. And it was to the point where I would just figure out how to do the things I needed to do in really debilitating pain. But now, since my last surgery, where I have very little pain and I have kind of an idea of what someone without a chronic illness and without debilitating pain feels like, I'm like, holy shit, I could have taken over the world. Yeah. Like this is completely bananas that people feel like this and just get to do their life like this. And so I think there's this other piece of just so much anger about losing decades of time to pain and to having to do the things that I wanted to do in a ton of pain. And that wasn't ever taken seriously until I was infertile. And I have anger about my diagnosis coming through infertility because me saying I was in debilitating pain wasn't enough for any doctor to give me the time of day or give a shit. But if it's impacting my fertility and I'm seeing an endocrinologist, a reproductive endocrinologist, and their stats for their center are all around how many live births they get through their center, they're all of a sudden really motivated to like figure out what the underlying cause of me not getting pregnant is. And one of the things I think pissed me off so bad about the experience is that so an official diagnosis of endometriosis can only be done through a surgery. Like they have to diagnose the tissue. But I did have endometriomas, which are like cysts in your ovaries that are caused from like endometriosis, and they look different than other cysts because they get filled up with like this dark blood. And so they call them chocolate chip cysts, which I think is like the grossest term. But they don't go away on their own. Typically, you have to have surgery to remove them. They're not like the cyclical ones where you get one and it bursts and then the next month it's gone. So when I had my first vaginal ultrasound and they looked at my ovaries, that reproductive endocrinologist was like, oh, I think you have endometriosis because I can see that you've got what looked like endometriomas in both of your ovaries. And that was the first time anyone had mentioned endometriosis to me. And, I was like 34, I think 35. And she was so casual about it. And I remember being like, well, wait, like, what does this mean? Because I had looked up and like, of course, when I was looking up symptoms, it came up all the time. But I was like, well, obviously, if I had this, someone would have told me that I had this. And she was so nonchalant about it. And then she was like, well, it's fine because like IVF, it won't impact your IVF chances. So like, we don't need to do anything about it. And then I went home, I looked some stuff up. I came back a few days later for another appointment. And I was like, looking this up about endometriosis, like, should I have surgery? Like, what should I do? Like, because I've been in really debilitating pain. And I remember her response, she was like, oh, you Googled it? Like, and this is just the most condescending tone. And she was like, just after your IVF cycle, just go on birth control. Like, that's literally all she said to me, and was so rude about it. And so that, like, all of it, like, I've had so many failures of the medical community that I can't even really talk about it because I have so much anger about it. And I think what's even amplified that is that when I first started my Instagram account and I started sharing some of my story about my diagnosis and my pain levels and all of this, realizing how common my story was, where I was just getting messages every day of people being like, oh yeah, me too. It also took me this long, and I also have these debilitating symptoms, and I also wasn't taken seriously. And I was like, that was just heartbreaking to me. There was a piece of like, I can't believe I experienced this. And then it was like, oh, we're all just experiencing this? Shit. Like, I didn't just have bad doctors. This is just what we get. Like, this is terrible. So I have so much anger, and I don't really have a place to channel it. Like, I don't even know what to do with it. It's so big that I'm just like, I can't touch it. It's like too big.
Thank you for sharing a very, very, very small fraction of it here. I mean, the only thing I can urge people listening is, if you are suffering with your reproductive cycle, and not just periods, right? Because I had ovulation pain. Oh, it's what do they call it? It's a German word. Mittelschmerz, I think. It's like middle of your cycle pain. Oh, this is normal. You're just ovulating. It's like for days at a time. It's like a knife is digging into me. It's terrible, debilitating. And I mean, again, I'm sure you, like me, know the extent to which this can really ravage people's lives. If you are struggling, it's please advocate for yourself. I know it's so frustrating to be showing up to doctor after doctor, to emergency room, to whatever it may be. But, you know, I still see the belief being so prevalent amongst women who I can say, not being a doctor, obviously I have no definitive answers, where I've said to my husband, we have one friend, for example, I said, this is not normal. I said, I can almost guarantee you she has endometriosis, or she's dealing with adenomyosis, I think it's called, which is something similar, but in the uterus, a bit different. I won't give you my medical explanations, but the point is, like, this is outside the norm, far outside of it. Although it has become very prevalent and common. I think they say about 1 in 10 women, to their best of their guess, has endometriosis. Like, just, I don't know. All we can do is shout about it, talk about it amongst each other. Hopefully, I mean, it's certainly not your responsibility to channel that rage into any sort of like productive cause, but just you speaking about it is so powerful. So I want to thank you for doing so here. And I know it can bring up a lot of emotion. So I appreciate you sharing really vulnerably.
Yeah. And I do try to talk about it. I think one of the reasons I don't talk about it more is that the system is so broken that I don't even know really what to tell people to do. Because like here in the US, when you're saying like advocate for yourself, like I literally went to dozens of doctors and got dismissed by all of them. And so the only time I actually was taken seriously was I started, like, once I had a name for it, then I could do my research. So then I started figuring out, like, okay, what do I need to do here? So the best like information that I was able to find at the time, there's a lot more out there now, I think. But there were 2 Facebook groups. So Nancy's Nook, which kept like a list of like the best like surgeons that you could go to for this, that do excision surgery globally. And then there's another group that kept a list called Endometriosis. It was a Facebook group. And so I looked at those 2. I spent like months just doing tons and tons of research. But I also had to travel out of state for both of my surgeries to get access to doctors who would listen and who would be able to do the type of surgery that I wanted to have. And not everybody has access to that. So almost all the specialists that I saw here were not in network. They're not in network with insurance companies, which the US healthcare, I won't even go into it, but there's a good reason why they're not. It's basically that insurance companies will not reimburse them what they need to do like the in-depth surgery that they need to do. That's the very, very short version of it. But when I went to one of the top centers here for endometriosis that's not in network with my insurance, the quote that I was getting, I'm trying to remember, it's like my insurance would have covered the hospital stay, but not the surgeon's fee. And they were like, well, we don't know how much the surgeon's fee is going to be because it depends on how extensive your endometriosis is. And we won't know that until we're actually doing surgery. So I'm trying to remember what it was, but I want to say it was between like I mean, it was like tens of thousands of dollars. Like, and I wouldn't know until I woke up how much my bill was going to be.
Yeah, crazy.
And so that's really hard to even if you have someone like local to you that's on this list, they're probably not going to be in network with your insurance. I was able to find 2 doctors. I've had 2 excision surgeries, 2 different doctors who were still in network with insurance companies. And I had to travel out of state for both of them. So not everybody can do that. Not everyone has the finances to do that. Not everyone has health insurance. So it's really hard here because the system is so broken. And I can tell you it's happened literally dozens and dozens of times at this point, where someone will hear me talk about having endometriosis. They'll message me saying, I think I have this too. I have a lot of the symptoms you're talking about. What should I do? And I'm like, try to find a specialist that you can talk to. Go look on this list. And they come back and say, well, there's not anyone in my state, or they're not in network with my insurance, which I totally get. But then they'll be like, I went and talked to my gynecologist and they told me that they could just do the surgery. And I won't go into all the like differences in surgeries, but I'm like, please try to get like a second opinion before you like make your decision, and try to send them some like resources about the difference in types of surgeries. And I swear every single time what happens is they have surgery with their local gynecologist. They don't do anything helpful during the surgery. They just sew them back up. And then a few months later, they message me and they're like, my pain's worse than ever. What should I do? And I'm like, ugh. And then I'm like, go see one of these doctors. And they're like, I can't because I don't have the money to travel and I don't have like, they're not in my health insurance. And it's so hard because I'm like, I don't know what to, there's not like something I can tell people to do that's like a good solution. So honestly, it's the biggest reason why I don't talk about it a lot is because I don't even know what I can do that's helpful. I can tell people my experience and what I think would be like in their best interest to do. But it's like, I hope you've got a shit ton of money and can like travel to see someone. Like, I hope you're really rich. Like, I don't know. What do you like? It's just really frustrating. So I don't know.
It's super frustrating. And I know it may be insufficient, but we will link to both of those groups in the show notes of today's episode. I think this is probably what you were alluding to. And we're, by the way, not medical experts, but from all of the research I've done and what I've heard from my own surgeon is that you want to be looking for what's referred to as an excision surgery versus ablation. The former being they effectively would remove any endometriosis should they find it like by the root, so to speak, if you think of it as a plant, versus ablation is basically burning what you would see, let's say, above the surface if your lesions are a plant, which they are not so lovely. An invasive species, if you will. Is that what you were sort of...
Yeah, because basically like the endometriosis lesions, it's like tissue that is implanted in different parts of your body. So the difference from what I understand, again, I'm not a medical, I can't give medical advice either, but like from my own personal research, what I understand of it is like, you can think of it like a weed, where if you have excision, they're actually cutting down into that tissue and getting the whole thing out, where ablation is just using a laser to like burn the surface off of it. And it's not actually getting rid of it. So not enough time to get into all of it, but I think the other piece of it that seems to be really important too is going through not just finding an excision specialist, but finding someone who has the skill level to work on different organs. Like if you have, like for me, my endometriosis was all over the place. I had it on my bladder, I had it on my appendix, I had it on my bowels, I had it on my colon. I had it in just a bunch of different areas, like in my abdominal cavity. And so I really needed a skilled surgeon. I had adhesions too. So like sticky tissue that was like sticking my ovary to things and sticking to my bowels. So to have a surgeon that can do that and work on all those organs and that can identify what endometriosis looks like in different forms, because a lot of doctors are just trained that it looks one way and it doesn't always just look one way. And then part of it comes down to how much time are they willing to spend on you too. So like my first surgery was 4 hours and my second surgery was 6 hours. And those times, basically what they were doing during all of that was just going like this through my entire, like, here to here. You can't see my hands, but like, for my entire like abdominal cavity and like pelvic area, they're looking for any speck of it that they can find. And to do that, they have to go through each like minuscule part of your body to look for it. And so if you don't have someone that has like the time or patience to do that, or the skill level to do that, then they're not going to get it all.
Thank you, Katy. This is for listeners, perhaps a bit of a departure, but I feel like this is it's really important for us to talk about. And further to that, I think, and this is a whole other separate conversation that probably is worth having with a lovely guest, or I'm happy to speak to it on my own as well. I actually reference it in, I think it's episode 5 or 6, where I share my own story, but having dealt with this sort of, chronic debilitating pain and associated symptoms in this region that is obviously so personal and sacred to us, it was definitely a factor and gave pause to me. And I know I've heard this from other women, like, do I even want to try and have a child and get pregnant? Because it's been like such sort of violence that I've experienced there. It's, it totally ties in if you're considering getting pregnant in your body versus adopting. Obviously there's different means and ways of having a child, which I want to honor here. So I'm curious. So I want to talk a little bit about this term childless versus child-free. And for everyone listening, these are broad terms that we tend to use and see, where childless, and of course we can talk about like what are we inferring, of course, through these words themselves. But childless is a person who had hoped to have a child and was unable to, whether, through various means, it can be various circumstances. Whereas child-free is someone who's chosen to be child-free. There's other terms we can use as well, like child-free by choice, child-free not by choice. First of all, what is the term that you use to describe yourself? Do you care which word is applied to your situation? And has that changed over time? And then the second part of it is, how important do you think these words are?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm going to try to keep this brief, because I could seriously talk about this like all day. But I'll try to give you like my main points on this. So I think if we're talking at the community level of like, how do we find each other and find the support that we're looking for, find the community that we're looking for, terminology is really helpful, because it helps us kind of differentiate like what experiences are we having and what do we need support around. And someone who is child-free versus childless, like those needs, in some ways there's some overlap, but in a lot of ways they differ a lot. And I would say the biggest component of that is the grief factor. And I will say too, like, I think especially if you look at media coverage or hearing people try to talk about our communities that are parents, there's a lot of confusion, and they're using the terms interchangeably, and sometimes they're using them and they're not making sense to what they're trying to say. So I do think terminology is important, especially as we're talking about community, finding each other, representation, like those bigger pictures. If I get like really a lot nerdier about it and look at like individual examples, I think it's really messy, because I don't think, in my experience of having talked to like literally thousands of people without kids, I don't think these two terms encapsulate most people's experience. Sometimes they do. Like sometimes there's someone who's like, I never wanted kids. I'm 100% happy about that. I never have any kind of grief around it. And I'm like, the definition, what we think of as like being child-free. And then I kind of see childless as like, I always wanted kids. I am overcome with grief. I am now just miserable for the rest of my life and to be pitied, and just can never experience any joy again because my life is destroyed. Like I see these like two kind of stereotypes as like, which of these boxes do you fit into? I know those are like extreme examples, but what I've seen is that, well, what you obviously see too, is that there's a lot of people who are ambivalent. They don't really fall neatly into either of those categories. There are a lot of people who have experiences that are complicated. Like sometimes when I hear someone who's child-free by choice say, well, I'm child-free because I have debilitating endometriosis and I was worried about what pregnancy would do to my body, or I was worried about if I could give the level of care to a child that I wanted to, because there's a lot of days where I can't get out of bed, right? and so they chose that. I think I've heard people say they're child free by choice who would have an example like
Yeah,
that.
for sure.
And I'm like, all right, was that by choice then? Like, I know it was, but like there were so many circumstances that really feel a little bit outside of your control of why you made that decision. So I'm not trying to gatekeep or say what any category, like who fits into what. Like I'm all for anybody identifying with whatever term they feel most comfortable with. But I guess it's more just to say that I don't think that, I think there's a large percentage of people without kids who don't put any label on themselves or who wouldn't feel like they fit neatly into either one of those boxes. And I think those boxes can be really challenging too, because, you know, for example, I saw a post by Rachel Cargill. She has the account of Rich Auntie Supreme, and she was posting about, it was something about like, if it was from someone else's account that she reposted, but it said something about if like you're someone who's not sure if you want kids, you're on the fence about it, just know that there might be some grief, like either way. Yeah. I think that's what it was. And a lot of people in the comments were saying like, no, I'm child free by choice and there is zero grief associated with this. And this is like kind of offensive for you to be saying that our choice carries grief. And I genuinely believe that there's like a good like chunk of the population that is true for, right? Like they're happy with their decision. They're not experiencing grief around it at all. But there were a lot of people in the comments that said, yeah, I'm child free by choice. And I kind of get this because sometimes I have these moments where I think it would have been nice to experience like this aspect of parenthood, or like, you know, it's complicated. Like, or people said like, yeah, I kind of grieve it because it's caused so many like rifts in my relationship with my friends, or I don't know, like people were expressing some grief around not having kids that were child free by choice. And I think when we say this is the experience of what it means to be child free, and we put like so many conditions around that, then I don't know. It's like, well, what about these people that definitely are child free by choice? This was their first choice, what they wanted, but is it okay for them? Yeah. Like, are they allowed to express some grief around it too? Because our experiences aren't just like one thing for a lot of us. So I personally use the term childless. For a while, I was using child free, and specifically like child free after infertility. But for me, being like a community builder, I went back to using childless because it was getting too confusing for people, I think, for me to be using a different term. And also, like, there's a lot of gatekeepers in the child-free community that get really mad at you if you use child-free as a term. So I don't know. It's kind of complicated for me, I guess, because I would say mindset-wise, where I'm at right now, I feel very, very little grief around not having kids. Like, I'll have moments that pop up, but they're so rare. And if somebody said to me right now, like I could snap my fingers and magically put like your baby in your arms right now, I would say no, because my life is not set up in a way that I want that anymore, or I'm at a place where that is even like, I don't desire that. I don't like, a baby would not fit into my life anymore. So where does that leave me? Like, I'm technically still childless, but I also don't want a baby. Yeah. Like, I would say mindset wise right now, I feel much more child free because I'm super happy with the life that I have, and a kid wouldn't fit into that anymore. And I wouldn't want that. So, but it's complicated, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I think if I use a child free, a lot of people would say, no, you're childless. And I am, and I feel child free, and sometimes I feel childless. So I just feel like those two terms are really trying to put a lot of people in boxes that they're just not expansive enough. Yeah. I think we need new language to have these conversations.
I totally agree. And for everyone listening, if you already were not appreciating everything that Katy has been sharing over this last hour, I mean, you've articulated that so well. You've spoken to the nuance so beautifully. And I think it's also an important conversation for us to be having on this podcast, because when you're on the fence, when you're unsure, I do think it's very natural, and perhaps I would say probably quite a bit more likely that you will experience some of these challenging emotions like grief, should you choose the child-free path, or should you choose to have kids, because there's a part of you that resides in both of those worlds. There's a part of you that sees the appeal of both having a child as well as remaining child free. And those emotions are totally normal. I mean, we are living complex human lives. You will not be immune to feeling what we like to label as difficult emotions, no matter what you choose. And I just want people to be really clear that everyone is welcome here. There's people I've spoken to who've gone through my programs who have, they are medically infertile, and they really feel that they want to make a decision for them, despite the extreme unlikelihood that they will be able to get pregnant, because they want to feel they have autonomy in their choice, and that this is not something that happened to them, but that's something that they are stepping into willingly. And I've spoken with other friends who have really wanted to have children that hasn't been the path for them, due to infertility or other circumstances. And they want to feel like, you might say, how can you choose a choice that effectively is being thrust upon you? But I do think there is this like sort of opening up that can happen over time, of course, after having grieved. And there's no end date. And of course that can continue as you've shared, but it's like choosing versus something, again, being chosen for you. And so I'm so glad that you shared that. I think, whether we end up not having kids due to circumstances like, let's say, not having met the right partner and really wanting to having envisioned having a child with a partner, or, timing not working out for various reasons. Yeah, like you say, we can be, quote, child free, but it doesn't mean that that's necessarily what we would have chosen if life looked differently, which often it doesn't. That's part of the terrible beauty, beautiful terribleness of life. So I'm curious, like, and of course it's a journey, I'm sure, that happened over time, but I love hearing you say that, like, I would choose this again today, not necessarily going back to the beginning, because life is and has been what it is, but like that you feel at peace with this. And by the way, folks, if you're listening, you're on the fence, you're really angsty, you're, keeping yourself up at night, you're spinning in circles, you're thinking this is the worst thing to ever happen to me. I don't want to, I'm being a little bit cheeky here. I don't want to dismiss the reality of that, but I also think there is a lot that we can learn from people who really, really wanted to have a child, who pursued very, emotionally, physically, painful things, and yet has found happiness in not having children. And you're a great example of that. So how did you arrive at where you are today? I mean, obviously, Cole's Notes, Cliff's Notes, I don't know what we call it in other countries, but as best as you can impart to us in this forum, how did you get there?
Well, I don't want to dismiss the grief. Like, I definitely had years where it was kind of all consuming, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever been through. And it was really awful. So I don't ever want to like make light of that experience and how freaking hard it was. Because I think for me, there's a sense of like, well, what did I actually lose? Because it's not like I had a child that I lost. Like I'm grieving something that like didn't ever exist, but it's the grief of like a loss of a dream and the loss of like the vision that you had for your future. So a lot of us make decisions based on, like, I'll just give my own example. Like when I was trying to become a parent, the job that I had, I wanted to stay at because I had really good benefits and I had really good, like healthcare, and I wanted to be in a neighborhood that had good school districts, and like I wanted to have different kinds of stability. So I was already making decisions about what I envisioned for my future. So that loss of your expectations and the planning and like the daydream that you had done, it's like that gets scrapped, and you have to figure out what does it look like to envision a life without kids. And if you've never done that, it was really scary. I didn't know what that was going to look like. And you've got all of society telling you you're not going to know true love, and you're not going to know what real happiness is, and you're not going to have meaning and fulfillment. Like, people can be really nasty around this. Like, I get really awful comments. You're going to die alone, all these things. So, people don't really like fluff it up to be this nice thing to not have kids. But what I would say is, once I got through the worst of my grief and I started to see examples of people who didn't have kids, and I really am grateful to the Childfree by Choice community for this too, because I think I found some really great examples there. But once I started to see examples of what it looked like to have a fulfilling life without kids, I realized I was seeing it as, if I become a mom, that is my ticket to joy and happiness and meaningful fulfillment and all these things that society tells you get through motherhood. And if I don't have kids, I am going to be in this level of grief all the time and not have any of those things. I'll never know what true love and joy and fulfillment, all those things are. And I think what I realized as I was able to step back and like process it was that it wasn't, there's not a right or wrong answer to it. Like if I had become a parent, my life would look very different. And I know that there are things that I would have really loved about being a parent and experiences that I really am sad that I'm not going to get to have. But I also see like the people around me and how much they have to sacrifice as a parent. And so a lot of things I enjoy that they aren't able to, because they are giving so much of their time and energy and attention and all of that to their kids, which is how it should be. But there are some downsides to it, right? Like you're giving up a lot to be a parent too. And it's the same thing with not having kids. It's like there are a lot of things that I miss out on, but there's also a lot of like perks that I found and things that I really enjoy about my life without kids. And so I don't really look at it as like I'm in a better or worse situation. I look at it as both paths I would have been happy. Both paths I would have experienced grief. Both paths I would have experienced like different kinds of connection, different kinds of loneliness, different kinds of meaning and fulfillment. Like I just stopped seeing it as like, this is the avenue to get all the things I want, and started seeing like, oh, actually, they're not that different in terms of I can find the experiences that I want to have of joy and love and meaning and fulfillment and what I do with my time and all of that. I can find all those things. They're just going to look different. And so that really opened up a new perspective to me of like, I don't feel like I chose, like, I don't think I did have a choice. So even when, I don't know, like I did have choices left that I could have pursued, but I wouldn't consider myself as having had choices. Like I consider myself definitely childless, not by choice. But I think I do have a choice in embracing the life that I do have and figuring out how I want to make the most of what actually exists in reality in my life. And there's so many ways to do that. And I think the hardest part is getting through like the worst of that grief to start to see possibilities and start to be able to embrace new like visions that you have for your future, or how you want to fill your time, or any of that. But I think it's like taking the value out of one or the other and just saying like, these are both valid experiences. You're going to experience a lot within both of these, and there's no like better or worse. They're just going to be different.
Yeah. Amen. Or a woman, depending. What do you love best about your child-free, childless life?
I think for me, it's like the time. Well, actually, it's the freedom I have with a lot of my resources. So I think like when you have kids, your like time, your energy, the relationships you invest in, like all your money, so much of that is like, it's allotted for already. Yeah. Like it has to be reserved to go funneled into this one place, just because that is the nature of parenting. But I feel like not having kids, what I really lean into and love is being able to have so much flexibility in where I spend my money, how I spend my free time, how I invest in like my relationships and choosing who I want to invest in, all of those things. I just feel like I have so much flexibility in that. And I really love having that, especially as someone with like chronic illness. And when I need self-care days, like all of that, I just really love not having to be responsible for anyone or anything, and just having that like freedom.
Yeah. All right. Before we wrap things up, I have 5 rapid fire questions I love asking all my guests. And I'm going to ask them a little bit differently based on your unique situation, if you will. So being childless not by choice is, finish the sentence.
Complicated.
Yeah. Being childless not by choice is not.
Only grief.
For those who are on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what do you think one thing that might make this decision a little bit easier is? Either something like culturally, societally, what might ease up some of that pressure around the decision?
I think talking to people, finding people that you can talk to or learn from on both sides, like parents and people who don't have kids, to learn about like the pros and cons of each and get that like binary view of like this is great and this isn't, like to be able to learn from other people's experiences and again to like realize that there's not a bad option.
Yeah.
You can make the most of either direction that it goes.
I really like that. What is one thing that you want parents to know? That
we miss you. Like I hear so much about like relationships getting fractured with friendships that are parents. It's probably one of the biggest things that comes up in the childless community. So I would say like, I don't know, how do we make bridges? Like I want more bridge making with friendships in particular. Because I think a lot of us miss our friends that are parents.
Yeah. All right. And lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether to have kids or stay child-free, what would that piece of advice be?
Learn from Keltie. Go to her programs. Listen to her podcast.
I love when people answer that. It's been a few. It hasn't been a ton. I had my husband on by the time your episode airs as well. And he also gave me like this shout out. And so did my mom. I was like, bless you guys. And you as well.
I mean, I did read a book called The Baby Decision, actually a few years into infertility, which is kind of a weird time to read it, I know, but that actually did help me to open up my mind and have to think through scenarios that she gives of examples in the book. That really did actually help me take it from less of a black and white thing to being able to see pros and cons, and that it was a lot more complicated than I've been viewing it. So I think that exploration piece and being willing to explore, finding a good therapist, finding support like you offer.
Thank you. Yeah. And we will link to The Baby Decision. That's Merle Bombardier's book. And I know Merle and she's fantastic. So we'll be sure to link to that as well. All right, Katy, what do we need to know about you? How can we find you? If somebody wants to connect after this episode, tell us all the things.
Well, my favorite place to hang out is on Instagram. So you can find me at Childless Collective. And if you're someone who is a woman or non-binary and you are childless not by choice and you're looking for a community, then come hang out with us in the Childless Collective. It's a private online community that's really awesome. We provide year-round support.
Yeah, amazing. And, likewise, if there are people in your life who are childless, not by choice, maybe share Katy's work, her page, the community, because we need to support one another in whatever path we end up finding ourselves on, whether by choice or by circumstance. So thank you so much for being here. I love chatting with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
That concludes another episode of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's conversation. Now, if you have not already done so, first of all, I want you to give us a follow over on Instagram. Our handle is @KidsOrChildFree. Otherwise, I will link to that in the show notes. And what I would love for you to do is to slide on into my DMs and let me know who would you like to hear on the podcast as an upcoming guest. This can either be someone in particular that you would love for me to have a conversation with, or maybe it's a certain type of guest. There's somebody in particular that you are wanting to hear from, whether that be, hey, Keltie, I want to hear from somebody who had kids later in life, or I want to hear from somebody who specializes in childhood trauma, or whatever it may be. Let me know who you want to hear from, who would be an ideal guest, and I will do my very best to get them onto the podcast for a future episode.